Do you need me to say anything to test it, or is it good?
Oh, it's good.
Good? Cool.
Answer your question. Let's see what we do. There's
Okay.
like schedule. Any of y'all are welcome to. Yeah.
Alrighty. Everyone, welcome to Reasonable Faith tonight. Good to have you all here. In the way of announcements, this Saturday is Pancakes and Pontification. We had to delay it by a week, but it is now this Saturday. So the 11th, we're going to have that. It is going to be it'll be at 7 o'clock. Location somewhat to be announced. I'll have to think about that. But it will be announced in the Discord.
Probably somewhere on campus. It's just a matter of when.
Ideally, but I'm not sure if we're going to be able to manage that.
Gotcha. Okay.
There was difficulties last time, so
Yeah.
we'll see. So there's that. I think that's only other big thing that's happening soon. Since we're now done with the Peter J. Williams talk, every single other talk for the rest of the year will be in this room, so no more jumping around. So, other than that, tonight we have our talk by Mr. Ryan Cruz here, and about the differences between the Gospels. And so I will leave it over to him.
Okay, thank you, Seth. You're sometime going to have to explain to me what the duck is about, because I saw the duck last week too, and I was like, "What is that?" But we can do that later. But I'm intrigued.
There are always ducks. There are ducks on the backs of our RF shirts.
There's a duck up there.
Oh, there is a duck up there. Okay. Oh.
It's sort of become the
Y'all are
club mascot.
There's lore.
okay. Interesting. Yeah.
Primarily because of Seth.
Clearly, I'm not up to date in the lore.
A joke where people throw them at each other and various things as well.
It's on the back of the
Rick, nice to see you.
Use inductive reasoning.
All right, folks. Well, let's go ahead and get started then. So, to open us up tonight, I want to ask you all a question. For those who are familiar with the story, when did Jesus curse the fig tree that had no figs? And I mean this rhetorical, by the way, because if y'all will humor me, I'm going to try to. I need 45 minutes to get through this, and then we'll do all the Q&A at the end, if that's all right. Just because I want to make sure that we actually get to the end, because it's a cumulative thing tonight. So, rhetorical question, but think to yourselves. When Jesus found a fig tree that had no figs, and he cursed it, when did that happen? The reason I ask that question is because according to Mark 12, Jesus found this tree that had no fruit as he departed from Bethany to head to the temple on the day that he drove, that was too far, hold up, on the day that he drove out the money changers from the Jerusalem temple. However, and when he cursed it, nothing happened immediately. But it was only on the following day that his disciples noticed that the tree had withered, and then they have a dialogue about it and its spiritual significance. The interesting bit is that according to Matthew 21, Jesus did not encounter the fig tree and curse it until the day after he cleared out the temple. And it withered immediately. Matthew even uses a Greek adverb parakrema, which means at once or immediately. Now, you can tell that Matthew and Mark are referring to the same event, because the event, this cursing of the fig tree episode, is directly tied to the clearing of the temple. So we know this is the same thing. It's not like these are two separate events. One of them has the whole unfolding happening over 2 days. One of them has it all happening at once. Clearly, somebody has monkeyed with the facts, because at once and on the next day are mutually exclusive temporal markers. So you can't really harmonize these. Somebody has changed it. Now, when one reads carefully through all four Gospels, you will notice that there are a number of differences in the accounts like this one, some of which appear irreconcilable. And for some, this can become a source of doubt or lead to a crisis of faith. For those who are perhaps considering Christianity, you might be turned off and completely turned away from both its message and its central protagonist, Jesus, if you believe that the Gospels contradict one another. Now, this is not a new problem. Concern over differences in the gospel accounts is actually an ancient phenomenon. It's not like it took the Enlightenment or modernity to wake us up from blissful ignorance and cause us to recognize that, yeah, there are problems here. On the contrary, it's been well understood since the dawn of the early church. So much so that many of those writing during the early church age actually mention it in their writings. One such individual is Eusebius of Caesarea, whom I have a nice little miniature of here on the screen. Who was a renowned church historian, and in one of his works, actually his most famous work, Church History, He wrote of those who struggled with the genealogies of of Jesus, given in Matthew and Luke. He writes that every believer in ignorance of the truth has been zealous to invent some explanation which shall harmonize the two passages. Now, I'm not going to cover what all the differences are here tonight, but there are several. There are various ways of approaching it. Eusebius actually goes on to document what they all are, and then he offers what he believes is the correct harmonization. But that's not the point. The point is, though he is probably speaking in hyperbole, it's interesting that Eusebius says every believer is zealous to invent some kind of harmonization. That shows you that this problem was understood even in his own day. So differences in the Gospels are nothing new. They were a troubling source of doubt even in ancient times. So that being the case, our topic tonight, how can we approach this issue objectively, and can we make any sense of the data and the apparent discrepancies that we are presented with? Are the Gospels still reliable guides to the life and ministry of Jesus, the central figure of the Christian faith? The way that I'm going to approach this tonight is in 4 stages. First, and I'm going to spend the most time here, we need to identify the genre of the Gospels. What are they? Doing so, determining what the genre is, will actually inform our understanding of how they work, and it will set our expectations concerning precision and accuracy. How we would expect them to behave given what they are or what they claim to be. Second, given the genre, we need to look at examples of how the Gospels employed the characteristic practices of their genre. It's one thing to complain about discrepancies in the abstract. It's an entirely other thing to actually look at specific examples and work through them and try to understand what is going on there. So as is my habit when I come with you guys, I'm going to try to give us at least 3 examples to go through tonight, time permitting. Now third, I'm trigger happy tonight, I apologize y'all. Third, having seen firsthand the kinds of differences that occur, the next thing that I would do, time permitting, was ask what are the implications of these data on the general historical reliability of the Gospels. I have 2 saving graces here. One, Peter Williams was here last week and talked specifically about this issue. When I learned that that was happening, I texted Alan and I was like, that is a providential coincidence. Like, this is great. Because I was going to try to fit that in here and it was going to be a struggle to land that plane on time. But I don't have to because Williams was here last week. The other thing is that I've been to this group before and spoken to you all on my thoughts on the historical core of the Gospels, specifically around the self-understanding of Jesus. So for those who are regular attenders of the group, you already know my stance. For those who haven't been here regularly, I do believe that there is a firm historical core in the Gospels that nothing that we're going to talk about tonight will change. And I will drop some breadcrumbs about this as we go along tonight, but I'm actually not going to do this section for the sake of time. But fourth and finally, we need to assess what are the implications of these preceding 3 sections for our handling of the Gospels, and most importantly, our trust in them as a reliable guide for the life and teaching of Jesus. So that is our roadmap for this evening. Without further ado, let me talk to you some about genre. What are the Gospels? While to some of you this may seem like an unnecessarily academic question with little practical value, it actually isn't. It's quite important. It largely comes down to this. What does genre tell us about what the authors were intending to do and what readers would have expected? Now, this is not an issue that is unique to the Gospels. It's no less true for them than for any other piece of literature. Think about it this way. If you read history as though it is a novel, you're a fool. If you read a novel as though it is history, you are naive. Knowing that a poem is a poem clues you in that the reader might be doing some things that are not to be taken literally because they might have a bit of an artistic flourish to them. For example, if you read Psalm 74 and you fail to recognize that the Psalms are poetic, you are left believing that God battled a multi-headed sea monster literally when he created the world. But I doubt many of you think that. And as far as I know, no exegetes actually think that. Because they recognize Psalm 74 is a poem. It's got some polemic involved there. And so we recognize the theological point that the author is making about Yahweh's transcendence over the pagan deities. But we're not actually, for the most part, I don't want to speak for all of you, but most people would not assume that God literally battled a multi-headed sea monster there because we recognize what is going on. The genre has attuned our expectations so that when we confront that, we know what we're dealing with. We need to do the same thing with the Gospels. So, genre matters. If I can put it this way, it sets boundaries on what an author is conventionally permitted to do, and then it sets our expectations accordingly. So, the question, what are the Gospels? What genre are they? To those who have not thought about this critically, I think it's perhaps natural to assume that the Gospels are something like modern news reports, right? They're like articles that seek to report the facts about Jesus and his ministry exactly as they occurred. After all, to be fair, the apostles were big on the importance of their being eyewitnesses, were they not? It's throughout the New Testament. You know, you can think of Peter in Acts 2. We were witnesses to these things. So certainly that's in play here. And so because of that, we can be forgiven for importing modern standards of eyewitness testimony and assuming that their writings, or those of their associates, would function in a similar fashion. What you read is exactly how it was, at least according to the eyewitnesses. Now, this is not a common view in the academy, but it does have some adherents. And one respected academic, who's actually a critic of the hypothesis that I'll advance tonight, suggested that the evangelists intended the Gospels as factually truthful reports. And report is a really interesting word choice because whether intended or not, although I think it was intended, it carries with it the connotation of investigative journalism in our day to day, right? It suggests that the Gospels had similar aims to what modern journalists do today, barring some bad examples of modern journalism. You know, if you think of true investigative reporting, right, that's what you think of when you hear the word report. At least that's what I think of, and I think that's what the author had in mind too. You know, nothing but the facts. That's the idea. This categorization, if true, would lead us to expect a very high degree of precision when dealing with the Gospels. But as we are going to see, in fact, as we already have seen in the case of the fig tree, there are some problems with this position since the Gospels do not always agree on what the facts are. Furthermore, to my knowledge, the practice of journalism and historical reporting as we are used to today does not have any analogy in the ancient world. That actually makes sense, right? Before writing materials were inexpensive, before recording devices existed, standards of precision were by necessity much lower than they are today. We live in an era that is very different from the rest of human history. But there is another alternative here, and that is the option of ancient biography. As early as 155 to 160, Justin Martyr, the early Christian apologist, referred to the Gospels as memoirs about Jesus. And for most of Christian history, it has been the default approach to consider the Gospels as some form of biography about the life of Jesus. Although it wasn't until the 20th century that scholars began consciously comparing the Gospels to other biographies from the Greco-Roman world. And when they did so, they noticed many points of analogy in terms of structural form and literary conventions, and we're going to talk about those tonight. Since that time, extensive research has been done in this area such that this view that the Gospels are ancient biography is now held by a fast-growing majority of scholars. Craig Keener, whom you may have heard of, very well-respected, very, very solid evangelical New Testament academic, has gone so far as to call this a general consensus. Keener's at Asbury, by the way, if you want to look him up later. Done a lot of work in this area. But what are Greco-Roman biographies like? I've said that they're similar. What are they actually like? Do the Gospels actually align as closely as is purported? Well, before I answer that directly, for starters, I need to say a word about the types of ancient biographies that have been examined so that you can see that what follows is based on a relatively wide body of evidence. It is not, as has been sometimes suggested by those who are critical of this hypothesis, just based on a handful of examples. That's simply not true. Biography was antiquity's most common genre, or one of antiquity's most common genres in the historical sphere, like letters, which incidentally we also see a lot of in the New Testament. In the Greek world, biography tended to focus on generals, statesmen, politicians. In the imperial era, it came to focus almost exclusively on the emperors for a period of time. But in the Greek world, it was common to focus on teachers and philosophers, and Jesus would actually fall into that latter category. When we look at those writings, we know of biographical or semi-biographical writings from many authors, including the selection that I have shown here. So we have numerous points of comparison. It's not just a couple of odd, bits and bobs that we're comparing the Gospels to. It's actually quite a lot of evidence. Now, it is true that the most important for us are going to be those living and writing around the 1st century and the turn of the early 2nd century, because that's when the Gospels came into existence. And so that would be this section right here. Philo and Josephus from the Jewish world, although they were Hellenized Jews, that is, Jews that were very much influenced by Greco-Roman culture, and then Tacitus, Plutarch, and Suetonius writing from the Greco-Roman world. When these biographers' works are examined, there is a list of common elements that emerges, and that'll be our basis for comparison with the Gospels. So these shared characteristics divide into structural or compositional characteristics as well as thematic characteristics. And the line here is a little bit fuzzy. I recognize that. Don't throw fruit at me. I am aware that there's a fuzzy line between these two that you'll see in a moment, but bear with me, humor me. From a structural standpoint, biography, or bioi as they are called in Greek, which just means lives, are works of prose that are comprised of a series of independent pericopes. And when I say pericope, what I mean is like an individual anecdote or episode, a self-contained story. And these pericopes have been stitched together from the life of a central character in order to form a synthetic continuous narrative. That is, the narrative is not completely continuous prose all on its own with no breaks. Rather, it's actually a series of stories about this person that have been stitched together to form a narrative, which this is not unlike what modern biographers do, right? Because they're collecting data about a person's life and arranging it thoughtfully. So I just want to point out there that that's not unique to the ancient world. That's something that we still do today, although there's some nuances to that. Although broadly chronological, ancient biographies were relatively imprecise when it comes to time. They were not particularly concerned with the chronology of individual events, and they often moved them around for thematic reasons. And this is closely related to my third structural point. For biographies that covered the lives of teachers and philosophers, it was common to group material topically rather than chronologically. And I think we're certainly seeing that in the Gospels. It's pretty much chronological at the beginning, it's chronological at the end. Most of what is in the middle has been moved around in order to serve various thematic purposes. This is why I said the line's a little fuzzy between structure and theme. But if we talk about thematic elements now, ancient biographies, like modern ones, were concerned with the life of a central protagonist, and they spent substantially less time talking about any secondary characters, even less so than a modern biography would, right? Where it might focus on some supporting characters who were significant in the life of the individual being discussed. Not as much the case in ancient biography. It pretty much is focused on this main character. Everybody else tends to be relatively flat. Not entirely, but relatively. Now, the biography often, though not always, made brief mention of the protagonist's birth or ancestry, and then they would move quickly into an illustrative examination of the protagonist's life. Now, it was illustrative and not exhaustive for a couple of reasons. One, Licona has actually argued that most biographies were intended to be read in a single sitting. So they probably would have been written on one scroll, and he did some statistics crunching and found that I don't think, if I remember correctly, any biographies tend to be more than like 25,000 words. So they're relatively, many of them are shorter than that. So they tend to be relatively short, intended to be taken in at one time. This is also because writing material is very expensive, right? So writing super long works like we have today is much more of an undertaking in the ancient world than it is for us. So, unlike some modern biographies, they're not exhaustive. And I get modern ones aren't either, but you know what I mean. There's a difference of degree here. They tend to be much more illustrative. Perhaps curiously to modern readers, ancient biographies spent a disproportionate amount of time focused on the subject's death. Their last days, their final teaching, their last words, and then their death. Disproportionate to the rest of the biography. It was believed that much of a person's character and virtue could be seen in the way that they approach death. And to give a pagan example here, if you think of the philosopher Socrates, Socrates is very renowned for the way that he approached his own death, right? It was an unjust death, but he faced it with dignity. He's even known to have comforted his own friends, at least according to his students and biographers. So he faced it bravely and with dignity, and that was a big deal. And so he was someone to imitate, we can put it that way, for many of his students after him. That illustrates the kind of thing that biography cares about, and it's a great segue into our last point here, which is that ancient biography tended to focus on one's character, their teaching, their principles, but that was a key intent, to hold up moral virtue and present a character as an epitome of a particular virtue or multiple virtues. They were someone who was worthy of imitation. And to give you an example here, Plutarch, in one of his works, wrote that I began writing my lives, that is my biographies, for the sake of others. But I find now that I am continuing the work for my own sake and delighting in it also for my own sake, using history as a mirror and endeavoring in a manner to fashion and adorn my life in conformity with the virtues therein depicted. Tacitus is not the only one who says such things. If you read in Isocrates, Tacitus, Lucian, just to name a few, they have similar comments. You're intended to imitate the protagonist and learn from their life. Philo and Josephus are similar here too, in the way that they hold up Moses as an ideal figure to imitate. So this was a key concern of biography. And that's going to come up again and again as we go throughout our evening together. Now, with a little bit of reflection, what I hope that you will recognize is that those elements characterize the Gospels just as well as they do any other individual written by the Greco-Roman biographers. The Gospels are essentially lives of Jesus. Each evangelist chose to arrange his biography a little bit differently, but all the essential contours are present. They, just like Plutarch said elsewhere, were painting portraits of Jesus that seek to highlight what Plutarch called the souls of men, right? Their key character or virtues, characteristics that they want posterity to know about, and what the overall arc of their life was even for, what it meant. In the same way, the Gospels are each portraits of Jesus. They emphasize different characteristics, but they broadly conform to the characteristics of this genre. If y'all think about a portrait, right, it's different from a picture. If you go and have a portrait painted of yourself by multiple different painters, they will all be a little bit different. It's not the same thing as, a video recording or a picture. And so if you think about the Gospels as portraits, that's a little bit more helpful than thinking about them as snapshots. Now, some people will bristle at this suggestion that the Gospels are bioi, or ancient biography, because they want to view them as something entirely unique, a Christian invention that has no parallel. But this really wouldn't make any sense. As Helen Bond of the University of Edinburgh suggests, texts need to employ conventional methods to communicate meaning. They can adapt and transform what they use, and indeed frequently do, but the idea that any written piece could hope to convey ideas through an entirely new genre seems unlikely. It makes sense that the Gospels would communicate in a contextually appropriate way. In fact, I was talking about this with Eric when we were walking in today, we already have indisputable evidence that they did so. Because the Gospels were written in Greek, which was not the native tongue of Jesus nor 3 out of the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, or John. Rather, they are written in Greek, which is the lingua franca of the Roman Empire, including Judea at the time, but it was the language that had currency with the audience and the world that the evangelists were trying to reach. So they did not write their Gospels in Aramaic. They wrote them in Greek because they were trying to reach the world that spoke Greek. Indeed, God's Word has a long history of accommodation and contextualization that goes all the way back to the Torah and runs throughout the Old Testament. Just think about the fact that many portions of Daniel are written in Aramaic, right? The Psalms communicate using pagan imagery sometimes. Does that mean that they're validating the pagan gods? No. God is contextualizing himself to say, hey, you worship Baal? I am greater than Baal. I'm the one who rides the clouds, who controls the storms, who walks over the sea and can part it at will. He uses that language through David and through the other psalmists because he is speaking in a contextually and powerfully appropriate way to his people in every era in which they live. The Gospels are no different, and so it shouldn't surprise us that they would choose to use what was one of the most common genres of their day. Now, I've said a lot. At this point, let me remind you why genre matters. Genre matters because it sets boundaries on what an author is conventionally permitted to do, and it calibrates our expectations accordingly. So, if the Gospels are ancient biography, what does that mean for our handling of them? Well, first, because biography is a subgenre of history, it does mean that the biography has to maintain a qualified correspondence to the facts. When people are writing a life of someone, that person was, most of the time, a real individual who actually existed, whom other people knew about, who had often already been documented or remembered in a variety of ways. So unlike novelists who are free to invent character in whatever way they wish, Bond reminds us, on the contrary, the biographer does have a certain limitation placed on them by historical reality. They do have to maintain a qualified correspondence to the facts. They may adapt their sources, but they can't just completely run off into left field. There are some caveats there. Since the goal of biography was to teach about the character of a person, capture their virtue, their teachings, their principles, the arc of their life, not to exhaustively recount history for its own sake, there was significant latitude that was permitted in the degree of precision that the biographer employed. They often made changes in their telling of events that served to highlight their biographical purposes. To quote Bond one more time, the biographer might make enhancements that help to draw out the character of their subject, though not to such an extent that it falsifies the central thrust of that character's life or the thrust of events. Christopher Pelling, who is a classic scholar, not a New Testament scholar, but has studied Plutarch at some length, he was formerly at the University of Oxford, he said of Plutarch that he does not always behave as we would. Certainly, he tidies and improves. In some cases, he must have known that he was being historically inaccurate. But the process has limits, and the untruthful tidying and improving is never very extensive. Additionally, contemporary wisdom, even in the writing of history proper at the time, was that style and clarity were actually more important than precision. There are compositional textbooks that teach you all of the ways that you can paraphrase your sources, and the degree of permissibility here was a lot broader than it is today. We're going to see examples of this later on. History itself was viewed as one long narrative. And so there are authors from the ancient world, these folks who write these compositional textbooks, who will say that it is more important to prioritize telling the story well. In fact, there's one historian who actually was very poorly regarded in his own day, even though he had an obsessive tendency to be precise with dates and facts and things like that. He's not well respected because he was a terrible storyteller. And on the contrary, those who were good storytellers were typically the ones that we have handed down to us as the great historians of the ancient world. Now, I want to be clear about something here. This is not to say that biographies were never precise, or specifically that the Gospels were never precise. If you were here last week, you heard Dr. Williams talk about several cases in which they were very precise, about the names of individuals, the names of towns, small incidental details that you really would not expect unless someone had actually been there. I'm not meaning to demean any of that. That is all still true. My point is that precision was not a strict requirement 100% of the time. And so we're going to see cases, like the case of the fig tree, where there are lapses in precision, and that is completely expected in this genre. And I think why some of those things happen will make a little bit more sense as we go through the examples, if it doesn't already. Last thing before we do that, I've mentioned that there was a degree of latitude here, that there were some compositional devices that people were taught and trained on how to use. What were those? What kinds of things did the biographers like Plutarch actually employ? Now, there are several lists here. Unfortunately, we don't have a perfect textbook from the ancient world that lists all of these things and exactly how they work. We do have something like that for paraphrasing, but it's a little bit more, you've got to do your research and read all these things. And so modern scholars have put together several lists. Some of these have been by classical scholars, some have been by New Testament scholars. What I'm going to give you tonight is in a slightly adapted version of a consolidated option that Michael Licona presented in his 2017 work called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, in whose honor I've named this lecture tonight. Licona suggested the following as what he called ancient compositional devices. First, transferal. Transferal, according to Licona, is when one author knowingly attributes words or deeds to one person when they actually belonged to a different person. So I might say something, but the biography is about Eric, so instead Eric is saying it in his biography. Or actually, and we're going to see an example of this, Eric may have said something, but for various narrative drama reasons, the biographer actually puts those words in my mouth. That's transferal. The second device is called displacement. Licona says that this is when an author knowingly uproots an event from its original context and transplants it into another context. Third, telescoping, which is closely related to compression. Telescoping is when an author presents an event as having either occurred earlier or later than what it actually occurred. And so here the image, right, is of a captain's telescope, right? It can expand, it can contract. That's the idea. You're doing that with timelines when you think about telescoping. Now this is closely related to something called compression. This is when an author knowingly portrays an event over a shorter period of time than the actual amount of time it took for those events to occur. The fig tree episode, probably compression. Matthew is compressing the whole episode into one day, when in reality it happened over a period of about 24 hours. Fourth is conflation. This is when an author combines events, or elements, excuse me, from two or more events or people and narrates them as if they were one. We'll see an example of that in a minute. Spotlighting is when an author focuses attention on one person so clearly that he does so to the exclusion of other characters who may have actually also been involved in that event. So 3 people are involved, the biography is only about one of them, so the other people are not mentioned. Or perhaps the antagonist is one of the 3 and they focus specifically on that antagonist. Right? There might be various reasons for this, but that's the idea with spotlighting. 6 is expansion. This is, according to Licona, this is when an author fills in gaps in the story with loosely factual details that cohere with the gist of the story but make it more complete. I'll admit this is where some people start to get a little bit uncomfortable because they're like, what, you mean they're just making stuff up? That's a very negative way to put it. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, although for some of them maybe. To give a perhaps more loose example, Xenophon, if he's recounting a battle, he may not actually know how the soldiers got to that battle, the exact route that they took. But he's telling you the story of the battle, and he wants to include how they got there. So he's like, they probably took this route along, the western coast of Greece. I'm making this up. He may not actually know that, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is the battle. That's the historical event that he covers, and that's what he cares about. He may, just to make it a more complete narrative, have filled in with a couple of comments here and there. I would actually challenge that we do this today when we tell stories. Maybe not that extreme, but when you tell somebody a story, you try to tell them a complete story, right? And so there might be a slight incidental detail here or there that you sort of gloss over or fill it in, smooth it out just a little bit, because it makes your story more complete, and it's completely unimportant to the point that you're trying to make. That's, I think, perhaps more germane to the type of expansion that we see in the Gospels. Now, there are some that would have a couple more extreme examples. I don't know that I personally hold to those, and unfortunately we don't have time to talk about them tonight, but know that there are some out there who do take that a little bit further than I will. Now, 7th, and finally, if you're like, oh my goodness, this list just keeps going, this is the last one. Simplification, which is closely related to paraphrasing. The idea here is that an author simplifies his sources by adapting the material, altering details that might complicate the overall narrative and cause the reader confusion. This is closely related or even overlapping with paraphrasing, and paraphrasing is any time that an author adapts his source material by altering syntax, adding words, omitting words, or even substituting words. This could be done for clarity, it could be done to provide a more vivid description, or it could be done for style, for pure literary artistry, because remember, it was important to tell the story well. That was a prized virtue among the biographers. Now, in a moment, we're going to look at 3 examples that cover some of these devices. Not all of them for the sake of time, but 3 that I think are helpful in illustrating the kinds of things that go on and how they work. For now, my question, again rhetorical, is what does this factual latitude mean for our view of the Gospels, for reliability? Does it mean that ancient biography did not have to be historically reliable? Now, I've already alluded to this, and I'll say it again now. That's not what I'm saying. Some biographers are very historically accurate. Some of them are more accurate than others. And so what you actually find is that there is a continuum. On the one end, there are those who care very much about historicity and accuracy, and actually Plutarch and Suetonius are down on that end. When you combine my lecture with Dr. Williams tonight or other things I've said here at UTD before, you'll find that I think the Gospels are down there too. But there is, at the other end, people like Xenophon, who in some of his works knowingly incorporates legendary material. And so that's not very historically accurate. So you have a spectrum. And the only way that you know with any given biography is by examining the evidence contained within. You actually have to do the work and compare it to that author's other writings, compare it to other biographies about the same person when those are available, compare the sources and see what you find. And again, you'll find that they fall on a spectrum. To assess that for the Gospels, you have to look at the evidence. So I've said a bunch about genre. This is our longest section tonight. I'm going to move faster from here on out. But to sum up everything that I've said, the Gospels belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. That means that they were at least broadly interested in history insofar as it related to their subject, Jesus of Nazareth. And they would have employed available sources, or in the case of Matthew and John, theoretically substituted from their own experience as eyewitnesses, assuming that you hold to traditional authorship. But given their focus on character, rather than history for its own sake, and their concern for style, there was a degree of latitude in precision that was allowed in their handling of those sources. And that's true for all biographers, not just for the Gospels. Some were more historical than others, and the only way that you can know is by actually looking at the data contained within. Capiche? Does that make sense? Okay, if you have questions about that, I certainly want to hear them. Let's look at these examples, and then I'll wrap up shortly after that, and we can talk about it. So, we could do this all night. Alan would not let me do that. Probably UTD would not let me do that. So I've picked 3 illustrative examples to go through where we can see how the gospel writers have used their sources or used perhaps their own eyewitness experience, traditions about Jesus with a latitude for modification. We now want to see what are those kinds of modifications in action, what do they look like, and what can they teach us about how this is going on in the Gospels more broadly. The first example that I want to go through tonight has to do with an occasion when Jesus healed a man with a withered hand. If you want to follow along in a Bible, you can, although I'm going to move quickly, so you may not be able to keep up. This first episode comes from Matthew 12, verses 9 to 14, or the parallel in Mark 3, 1 to 6, which is also paralleled in Luke 6, verses 6 to 11. This one is not found in the Gospel of John. Now, the event occurred in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and we are told that the eyes of the scribes and Pharisees present were fixed on Jesus to see whether he would heal this man, which they would have considered a violation of the Sabbath law. Because remember, there was a prohibition against work on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees apparently considered that healing would have been work. In all 3 of the synoptics, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there is a question raised whether it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath. But Jesus does perform the healing, and the Pharisees become indignant and begin plotting to destroy him in the aftermath. That's what's the same. But there are some significant differences in the way that the account is told. The first thing that we're going to see is an example of transferal. In Matthew and Luke, Jesus sees this man who is there and has a withered hand, and he beckons him to come near. He then poses a question to the scribes and Pharisees. Would it be lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, the question is rhetorical. Jesus is not asking for information. He is, in fact, putting his detractors to the test to see how they will respond. What's interesting is that in Matthew, it is the Pharisees that do the questioning, not Jesus. They ask Jesus whether it is lawful to heal on the Sabbath. And Matthew adds an editorial comment that this was in order to test Jesus, in order that they might accuse him. So it seems like Matthew has made a stylistic change here by changing the angle of confrontation. Now, by the end of the episode, we know no matter what, whichever one you read, the Pharisees are going to go after Jesus. Matthew just makes that explicit from the start, rather than implied, because he puts the challenge on the lips of the Pharisees rather than on the lips of Jesus. But either way, they are watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. That's clear no matter which one you read. Now, the second device that might be in play here is that Matthew shows some evidence of conflation. In Matthew alone, Jesus answers the question, and he does so by drawing a comparison with livestock. Which of you, he asks, would not rescue a sheep if it fell into a pit on the Sabbath? How much more valuable is a man than sheep? This is what Jesus says. Now, neither Mark nor Luke include that saying in this pericope. They don't have it. But very interestingly, on 2 separate occasions in Luke, Jesus says something similar. Luke 13:15 and Luke 14:5. These both account other instances when Jesus healed on the Sabbath. In the first case, he healed a woman who was disabled. In the second case, he healed a man who had edema. And in both cases, Jesus challenged the judgmental scribes and Pharisees by asking them, would they have taken care of their own on the Sabbath? In the Luke 13 example, he mentions an ox or a donkey, and in the Luke 14 example, it is an ox or son. And the latter is the especially close parallel because Jesus also mentions falling into a well, which is very similar to what Matthew has with falling into a pit, right? It's the same idea. So Matthew seems to have conflated the Sabbath healings and extracted a saying of Jesus that occurred during one healing, and he has transplanted it into another one. Interestingly, Matthew does not include either of these 2 episodes that are in Luke 13 or 14. It's like he has smushed them all into one illustrative example. And what's interesting is that Matthew actually does this on several different occasions. Where there are 2 instances of Jesus healing a blind man in Mark, there is 1 in Matthew. While there are 2 instances of Jesus healing a demoniac in the early part of Mark's gospel, there is 1 in Matthew. It's a known phenomenon that he tends to smush things together. Even in the fig tree example, he smushes time together, compresses it all to occur on one day. Interestingly, though, Matthew is longer than Mark, in any individual pericope, he is shorter. He tends to abbreviate so that he can fit more content overall. Very interesting when you study his style, but that seems to be the kind of thing that Matthew does. Now, for our third device, and the last one we'll talk about in this example, both Matthew and Luke simplify Jesus' action or paraphrase it when he actually healed the man. In Mark, Jesus is explicitly described as being angry when he looked around the room, grieved at the hard hearts of the Pharisees. But Matthew 12:13 and Luke 6:10 are curiously drop this element of the story. Luke just deletes the mention of anger, but he has that Jesus looked around the room. Matthew omits the entire sentence. This is not the only occasion where Matthew and Luke do this, by the way, where they soften Mark's portrait of Jesus, specifically with him being angry. So Mark 1:41, which that's an interesting problem because there's a textual issue there too, but I take it from a textual criticism standpoint. Mark 1:41 originally read that Jesus was moved with anger when he healed that leper, and we can talk another time about why that might have been. Matthew and Luke omit that participle. There is no mention of moved with anger, moved with compassion, either one. It's just gone. In Mark 9:23 and 9:49, they soften some of Jesus' more fiery rebukes of the crowds that he is engaging with. They also omit other potentially embarrassing details about Jesus, specifically regarding the extent of his knowledge. In Mark 2:26, Jesus makes what appears to be an errant reference to Jesus entering the tabernacle during the high priesthood of Abiathar, but it's well known that Ahimelech was actually the high priest when that occurred. Now there's a solution there that I don't think you have to resort to Jesus didn't know what he was talking about, but Matthew and Luke just drop it. Matthew actually corrects it to Ahimelech, Luke just drops it. It's just gone. Why? Potentially, they seem to be softening this portrait of Jesus. A really infamous one is in concerning Jesus' knowledge of the hour of his own return. Mark 13, Jesus says, no one knows the hour of his return, not even the Son, nor the Son, actually, is how it's worded. And in Matthew, again, there's a textual problem here, but I think it's pretty solid ground. Matthew omits that. But he still, interestingly, has Jesus saying that the Father alone knows the hour. And that's interesting because it's saying the same thing, but it's more subtle. So what's going on here? Probably Luke and Matthew are removing things that they think could lead to a misunderstanding about Jesus. They are careful to still preserve his humanity. That is throughout the Gospels. Remember, Matthew still says the Father only knows the hour of his return. Jesus still gets into conflict with the Pharisees and gets angry. He drives people out of the temple in all four of the Gospels. So there is a righteous anger there that is not eliminated in any of the cases. But in these more fringe examples that are a bit more challenging that cause us to really scratch our head and go, what in the world is going on there, Mark? Conveniently not there in Matthew and Luke. And so they seem to, for apologetic reasons, be softening that. And remember, a key emphasis of biography is to highlight the character of the individual being portrayed. Could it be that Matthew and Luke are trying to not to portray Jesus in a way that he wasn't, but to remove things that they thought could have been subject to misunderstanding? That seems to be going on here. If this was the only case, it'd be iffy, but there's a lot of cases of these. And so I think it's pretty reasonable to think that that is going on. Like Pelling and Bond said of Plutarch, there might be some tidying, some improvement with the source material that is going on, but it is never to such an extent that it falsifies the central thrust of the character's life. So let's go now to our second example, which is the parable of the sower, which is a personal favorite of mine that I get to teach on a lot at church. This occurs in Matthew 13, verses 1 to 23, Mark 4, 1 to 9, and Luke 8, 4 to 15. Now, the core message and content of this parable are the same in all three of the synoptics. Again, this one is not in John. Jesus emphasizes that faith is meant to lead one to fruitfulness. It's supposed to take you somewhere. And he presents three illustrative obstacles that can prevent that from happening. There are three different soils that are standing in for or imaging the devil, persecution, and misplaced priorities. So that's what's the same. But again, there are several differences in the details that align to at least two of the devices that we have identified. First, there is displacement in play here concerning the setting. In Matthew and Mark, the parable of the sower is told from a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and it's one of just several parables that Jesus teaches concerning the kingdom of God. But in Luke, there's no mention of the sea. There's no mention of a boat, and the other parables are gone. So what's happened? Well, Luke seems to have displaced the event, or the parable, compared to Matthew and Mark, and I think that he has done so to deliberately rearrange it so that it follows Luke 7:36-50. Which Luke 7:36-50 is a story only contained in Luke, and it tells of a woman who was a sinful woman in her community who was moved by her faith to overflow in an abundance of love and gratitude to Jesus by anointing his feet with a very expensive perfume. In fact, enormously expensive. Similar event happened during his Passion Week. Not the same as this one. There are some details that make it clear. These are two different events that are being described. And that event seems to have a similar, if not the same, thrust to how Luke portrays the parable of the sower. So could it be that Luke has topically grouped the two, that the parable of the sower is explicitly hammering home a theme that Jesus has, but Luke has already raised implicitly in his last pericope, and now he is nailing it home. This thing that you saw the woman do, Jesus is now going to tell you about it. Faith is meant to lead you someplace. Remember, biographies have a habit of not caring as much about broad chronology and tending to group things more thematically or topically. In fact, it's likely that even Matthew and Mark have created at least somewhat artificial locations for the parable because it appears as an anthology in both of them, right? It's a collection of all these parables that have been brought together. Now, it doesn't mean that Jesus couldn't have taught all those parables at one time. He could have, but it's also possible that Matthew and Luke have grouped them. Sorry, not Luke, Mark. Matthew and Mark have grouped them together, and Luke has put it in a different location. But that's not a problem, because remember that all of these ideas go back to Jesus. They're all legitimate reflections of his life, of his teaching, and that's what the biographer cares about. They don't care about specific chronology, except broadly speaking, big brushstrokes about the beginning of their ministry, their early life, if they include it, and then their death. Now, secondly, and I'll move fast here because I know we're running short on time, we can observe that Luke probably simplifies and paraphrases Jesus' concluding statement. In Matthew and Mark, when his concluding statement of the parable, that is, in Matthew and Mark, Jesus says that the seed that lands on the fourth soil, which is the soil that is good and productive, some of it produces 30-fold grain, some 60-fold, some 100-fold. Luke does not say that. He says instead that this seed will just produce 100-fold as much grain, 100 times as much grain. And so his focus seems to be qualitative rather than quantitative, right? He is interested not so much in the degree of your fruitfulness, but the fact of it, which is consistent with what the woman did in the previous pericope, right? Faith is meant to lead you somewhere. I think Luke is very keen that the reader pick that up. And guess what? That's fine, because that goes back to Jesus. That is certainly a part of his teaching. That's there even in Matthew and Mark. It's just there front and center without distraction in the way that Luke presents it. And so both of them, both the degree and the fact of, when it comes to fruitfulness, can both be legitimately gleaned from Jesus' teaching. That's perfectly reasonable exegesis. And it's also consistent with Jesus' teaching in other places. The authors are just doing something slightly different in what they are emphasizing. Remember, they are painting a portrait, not taking a snapshot. All right, last example. I'll be especially quick here because I want to wrap up shortly after 8. The third and final example today concerns the date and time of the crucifixion. Now this, incidentally, is a controversial one. I had to throw one controversial one in here just because, right? You've got to do that. This is inextricably related to the date and time of Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples. In all of the Gospels, Jesus ate a final meal that involved Passover imagery with his disciples on the night that he was betrayed and taken into custody. After a series of legal proceedings, he was crucified by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, on the following day. The issue is related to the timing of the Passover observance proper. Specifically, were the Passover lambs sacrificed on the day of the meal, such that the Last Supper was the Passover meal, or were they sacrificed on the day of the crucifixion? There seems to be a 24-hour time gap between what John has and what Matthew, Mark, and Luke have concerning the death of Jesus. Here's some of the data. Mark 14:12, Matthew 26:17, Luke 22:7-8, all explicit. Jesus sends his disciples into town to prepare for the Passover meal. This is direct evidence that when coupled with circumstantial data from details of the meal itself, make it very difficult to dispute that the meal that we call the Last Supper was not the Passover observance that Jesus was celebrating with his disciples. But there are some verses in John that create some difficulty. In John 13:1, he indicates, or seems to indicate, that this meal was before the Passover. Or at least Jesus' action in washing the disciples' feet was before the Passover. But the real trouble is John 18:28, when he says that the Jews would not enter Pilate's residence on the following day because they did not want to become ceremonially unclean and unable to eat the Passover meal. John 19:14 is also a little bit difficult. There are some ways that you can just harmonize that and it doesn't seem to be quite as much of a direct contradiction, but there's some minor difficulty there. But what's interesting about 19:14 is that John also changes the time of day that Jesus was crucified, or at least he seems to. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is crucified. He's already hanging on the cross at 9 a.m., the third hour, according to Hebrew reckoning. But in John's gospel, Jesus is still with Pilate at the 6th hour, which is noon. So the time has changed also. What is the significance of that? In John, the crucifixion occurs at exactly the same time that the Passover lambs would have been sacrificed, which fits really poignantly well with John the Baptist's exclamation in John 1:29, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." If you want to see the data, I've tabled it up here. I know that might be a little bit small for you, and I wish I could go through this in detail, but I just can't for time. But you can see what's going on here, right? In the synoptics, the lambs are sacrificed the day before. Jesus is crucified the day after. In John, they happen at the same time. So it's like John is very clear that you recognize Jesus is the Passover lamb. Now here's the thing. That's in the synoptics, right? Jesus reconfigures the Passover imagery to be about his own sacrifice. So Jesus is still the Passover lamb in the synoptics. 1 Corinthians, 5:17, I think. I should have that, 5:7, excuse me. And 1 Peter 1:19, both Paul and Peter call Jesus our Passover lamb. So it's not like John, even if he was playing loose with the data, he's not making this up, right? This is true regardless. It's a theological, metaphorical truth. But has John monkeyed with the chronological data a little bit to make it just even more emphasized so that you can't miss it if you're in his culture, that Jesus is actually dying at the exact time that the Passover lambs are being sacrificed? This is the controversy, because some people are like, I don't know about that. John's moving an event from one day to another. Maybe, but didn't Matthew move some elements of the fig tree episode? I think that he did. I think that one's very hard to get around. There are some alternate explanations here. I don't think any of them are terribly satisfying. The one that does the best chance of explaining it besides displacement is that John is thinking of the Passover as the entire week of celebration rather than a particular day. And Josephus does occasionally use Pascha to refer to a whole week. So it's not totally unknown, but that doesn't explain the time difference from the 3rd hour to the 6th hour, which puts Jesus dying at exactly the time when the lamb sacrifices would have started, because they started the afternoon before the Passover meal was observed, because there would be so many to be slaughtered that they took the entire afternoon to do it. So I don't know. I'm willing to be wrong here. My take on this is that John is being deliberately ambiguous with the time. Not that he's necessarily saying something that's wrong, right? Because you could take the Josephus approach that Pascha refers to the whole week. But it seems like he's being deliberately ambiguous so that he can powerfully reinforce something that was already true, but is now even more clear. Jesus is the Passover lamb. And so that would be a case of chronological displacement. Again, that one's more controversial. I'm willing to be wrong there, but I'm not alone in regarding that as probably what is going on there. Now, let's wrap up very quickly, just give me a couple minutes and I'm done, by assessing the theological implications of all this. What does this mean for Christian theology? What does it mean for life and practice? What does it mean if you're a seeker assessing the truth of Christianity? And so to answer this, I have to address the two audiences that I just alluded to. First, if you are not a Christian, but you're interested in Christianity, or you were, and now you're skeptical about it, or perhaps you were skeptical to begin with, either way, don't get hung up on differences that do not impact the core historical facts of the overall life and character of Jesus. The fact is, Jesus believed himself to be God. He claimed to be the arbiter of your eternal destiny. He promised that forgiveness was available through him and only through him, and that he could reconcile you with God. And then he claimed that his resurrection from the dead would establish the truth of his claims, that he really was who he said he was, that he was God himself. I have argued that case here before. Peter Williams didn't directly discuss that, but he discussed a lot of incidental historical and archaeological facts that corroborate the overall historicity of the Gospels last week. That's the issue. The core question is, who did Jesus claim to be, and did he really rise from the dead? That's what you need to focus on. Don't get distracted by these things that just don't matter for answering that question. It's a very interesting and helpful in-house discussion, and I'm going to argue why it's helpful in just a moment. But for anyone who is interested in Christianity but would not yet identify as a Christian, know that we have nothing to hide here. This is not what you need to be hung up on. This is not what you need to be worried about. You need to be focused on the core historical kernel around the life and person of Jesus. Now, second, for those of you who are Christians, which I know is many of you in this room, if allowance of these literary conventions feels like an abandonment of a commitment to inerrancy or inspiration, then I have to politely challenge you that your faith is too small. Because your faith should be about a person, not about a modern misunderstanding of how God should have done his job or how God should have worked. I mean, think about it that way. We live in an era of great chronological snobbery, so much so that we sit in the judgment seat to tell God how he should have worked through these people 2,000 years ago. I mean, come on. When we step back and think about it, that's unreasonable. The early church, the church of Acts 2, they did not have the Gospels. The church that Paul wrote to, they did not have the Gospels. Their faith was about a person. It was in Jesus and only in Jesus. Now, I don't mean to diminish the Scripture or the inerrancy or inspiration of Scripture, which I wholly hold to. But your faith should be big enough to allow you to follow the truth wherever it leads and discover the ways that God did work in inspiration rather than how we think he should have worked. And this is important because in so doing, you will free yourself from being shackled to straw man misconceptions that can actually prove very damaging to your faith. If you think that the Gospels are reports in the modern journalistic sense, you are setting yourself up for doubt because somebody's going to come along with the fig tree or with other cases like that, and you're going to have a hard time getting out of that. But you don't need to. That's my point tonight. You don't need to do that. Instead, you can appreciate the beautiful literary tapestry that we have received and keep the main thing the main thing, right? Focus on the person of Jesus, focus on his life, his teaching, and who he claimed to be and what happened with that empty tomb. Don't worry about these things unless your worry is to appreciate what each author is doing. Appreciate the way that Luke has topically grouped things so that he can really poignantly hammer home that faith is meant to lead to fruitfulness. If you agree with it, appreciate the way that John is so keen to make sure that you understand that Jesus is the Passover lamb. That thing that happened all the way back in Exodus, that's Jesus. John doesn't want you to miss that. All right, so appreciate those things, but keep the main thing the main thing. Base your life on the most famous figure in Christian history. Base your faith on this most famous figure, the God-man, Jesus Christ. That's it. Thank you. All right, so I went a little bit over. I do apologize for that, but I think we've still got like 10, 15 minutes, right, Alan? So I'd be happy to take whatever questions you all have. Yeah.
Rowan, so the compositional devices that you talked about, do most or all of them apply to the other books of the Bibles that aren't in the same genre?
No, they do not, because I mean they might, but you can't just like blanket carry them over, because those are the way that we got to those lists is by examining. You remember that slide where I had like all the different biographers that had written? So people like Craig Keener, they just go and read those. They read all of them. They spend years studying them and comparing them, and they're producing those lists. With the exception of the paraphrasing bit, like we actually have compositional textbooks that are like, here's all the ways that you can paraphrase, which is kind of nice. But the other ones are discovered more inductively, and they're characteristics of this genre. So while they could be used someplace else, and like they are used, some of them are used in historiography, which is the writing of history proper, things like Herodotus and Livy and other Greco-Roman historians. You can't just like blanketly apply them to anything. Now, what I think you can do with some degree of certainty is just anticipate that in general, precision is going to be lower in the ancient world than it is today. they don't have recording devices. They don't have phones, they don't have cameras, they don't have microphones. So everything that they're doing is a little bit more loose than everything that we're doing. But that's the way it's been for most of human history. I mean, we live in an era of great chronological snobbery because of technology. And we have to remind ourselves that sometimes. But is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good question. Anybody else? Yeah, Eric?
Were you able to repeat the question for the sake of recording?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well played, sir. The question on that was, are we able to apply these same compositional devices to other books in the Bible outside of the Gospels? So my previous answer applied to that.
Have you looked at, Tim McGrew has an interesting proposed harmonization for that case of John and the timing of the crucifixion.
What does he say? I don't know if I've read
I'm a
McGrew.
little vague on the details, but it seemed pretty compelling. But it was couched more in terms of Passover involves multiple meals and so forth.
Yeah,
And he had some interesting tidbits that seemed to tie it into the things going on, like there was a different meal potentially at Passover.
yeah. So that's basically the other option that I kind of mentioned in passing is
Yeah, it
that
seems
Pascha.
like a week.
Yeah, the Passover refers to the full week of festivities and not just the single day. That, I think, is the second best option. There have been a lot. Actually, if any of you go and look up Darrell Bock's commentary on the Gospel of Luke, in the appendix to that, to volume 2 of that exhaustive commentary, he has a whole excursus just about this timing problem. And he presents like 20 different cases that have been brought up. He narrows it down to 3 that he thinks are most possible. One of them is that one, which actually is what Bock thinks. Another one is that there's 2 different calendars in play, but there are some problems with that. And then the third one, which a lot of people hold to, is the displacement view that John is playing a little bit fast and loose and moving things. I actually think I fall at some combination of the 2. And, I'm willing to think that John is using Passover as a whole week, but that he's being a little bit fast and loose with it. And part of my reason for saying that is because he changes the time too, not just the day. And Lycona is big to point that out. He's like, even if you can solve the day, you have to solve the
Yeah, I
time.
didn't really notice the time thing. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
So what some people have argued is that John is reckoning a Roman civil day rather than a Hebrew day.
I was wondering about that.
And
Does
so,
that fit, or-
well, some people think it does, but some think it doesn't. Actually, incidentally, Bach is fine with that explanation. But I read some other commentaries on John, and they're like, yeah, I don't think that really fits. And Lycona, citing somebody else, is like, there's way too much that would happen in order for that to be true. Because if that was true, that means that John, the 6th hour then becomes 6 a.m. because the Roman day reckons from midnight, like ours does. So that means that John has Jesus with Pilate at the very last bit before he goes to the cross at 6 a.m., which means that literally everything that happened with Jesus being examined by the Sanhedrin, Jesus going to Pilate the first time, Jesus going to Herod, Jesus going back to Pilate, being scourged, all of that has to happen before 6 a.m. But most Roman civil business didn't start until around 9, and so even if you think that they got Pilate up early, that's really early. And then Herod would have to get up that early, and that's very unlikely. So it seems to stretch the facts of the events a little bit to think that all of that could have happened in that span of time. Yeah.
I thought that maybe that third hour was the start of the period where the scourging happened, and they called that part of the crucifixion. Is that a possibility?
I don't think so, because I think in Mark, I wish I had a bookmark. I think so Mark 15 is the place to go, and I think he has Jesus hanging on the cross at the third hour, which in the Hebrew reckoning would be 9 a.m. Yeah, good question. It's a tough problem. Bach actually calls it the toughest chronological problem in the New Testament. But I had to mention it because it's too. This is one that everybody gripes about, so I had to bring that one out there. Yeah, Seth.
So if we open the door to like letting some of the gospels like soften certain aspects of Jesus
Mhm.
in some ways, or kind of alter how they're presenting things.
Yep.
Does this lend more credence to theories like, oh well, he never really claimed to be God, and his divinity just solely
No.
developed from Mark to John?
Yeah, good question. So Seth's question was, if we allow that the gospel writers could, to have some latitude with the degree of precision in the way that they're presenting certain details about Jesus, particularly his character, like the extent of his knowledge or his being angry with other individuals, can we also apply that same reasoning that maybe Jesus, is it a slippery slope that maybe Jesus never said that he was God and that that's just an invention of the gospel writers? No, I don't think so. And to that, I'll have to briefly allude to the talk that I've done here previously on the self-understanding of Jesus. And let me actually flip forward to an appendix slide that I originally wanted to cover and just did not have time to. And actually, each of these was supposed to be its own slide, so you can see how there's no way we were going to get through all this. But there are historically objective methods that you can employ to discover whether or not something stands a good chance of being a real, authentic historical event. These are not just true for the Gospels, it's for any number of documents that you look at, right? Those are things like the principle of multiple attestation, which says that if you find something that's in more than one independent source, right? So they can't have used one another, they have to be, and so this isn't just each of the 4 Gospels, but if you find something in Mark, and you find something in the shared material between Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark, and you find something in John, that's 3 independent sources that are all saying the same thing. In any other sphere of history, that's regarded as a pretty likely to be historical bedrock. Things like the principle of embarrassment. Would the gospel authors have made this up? Is it likely that if they were making up the story, if they were changing these details, would they have done that? It's suspicious that Matthew and Luke delete Jesus mentioning Abiathar. They don't add it, right? It's not like Mark is adding it in. And so there are some cases bound up with things that Jesus claims about himself that are inherently ambiguous or they're embarrassing. Things that you wouldn't make up about your, Jewish Messiah who is supposed to deliver you from the Romans and save the world and do all that stuff. So using principles like that, you can come up with lists like these ones. Put your skeptic's hat on. Assume for a second that the Gospels are nothing more than ancient documents. They're not inspired, they're not inerrant, whatever. Just look at them with principles like those. You still come up with a list like this. This was a study done by Bach and a number of other scholars. Robert Webb was one of them. They were the editors. And they looked at what they considered to be 12 key events in the life of the historical Jesus that are bedrock with these kinds of principles. And I mean, look at this. This is a pretty good list. Like this is, you don't have the Gospels, you're the early church, Jesus is God. Like that, that's the kind of place that you get here. Now the last one's interesting because you might be thinking they're saying that the resurrection is historically verifiable. They're actually, they pander to the other side because they are, trying to reach others as well. And they say, no, we're not saying that, but we're saying that there was an empty tomb. And the disciples went from being cowards to being these fearless martyrs claiming that Jesus rose from the dead when they would have no reason for making that up. Where'd that come from? So I don't think so, Seth. It's a good question, but we can still apply these objectively verifiable principles and tests and come up with a historical core, even when wearing our skeptic's hat, that broadly conforms to the exact same gospel that, if you're a Christian, that you believe. That Jesus saw himself, if I could summarize all this, he saw himself at the center of the program of God. He clearly claimed that he was the Jewish Messiah, and that comes from Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, right, that you are the Christ, which is the Messiah. He also reinforced that imagery when he executed his triumphal entry, coming into Jerusalem, when he's deliberately fulfilling prophetic speech about what the Messiah was supposed to do, same with cleansing the temple. But then he reconfigures some of it, and he makes himself at the center of the Passover imagery. He's examined by the Sanhedrin, and while he's there, he makes one of the most dramatic claims to deity that he can by juxtaposing Psalm 110:1 and Daniel 7:13, saying, you'll see the Son of Man riding the clouds and seated at the right hand of Yahweh, basically, which is divinity. No one sits in God's presence. No one rides the clouds except God. He also does things, and actually the most important way that you settle on his deity is not even through Jesus' words, although the Sanhedrin examination one is really helpful. It's actually what he does. I did a study on Luke 8 at church on the episode of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. Do you know who calms the storm in the Old Testament? Yahweh. Who, controls the wind and the waves? It's Yahweh. Who's the only person who rides the clouds in the Old Testament or in any pagan, ancient Near Eastern religion? God. Only God rides the clouds. Who forgives sins? God. Who has authority to say that they are Lord of the Sabbath? The Sabbath is the Lord's day. Who is the Lord of the Lord's day? The Lord, God, right? And so it's the things that Jesus does, even more than what he says, that show you, yeah, this man definitely had a divine self-consciousness. and I'm at this point now rambling, but you don't need the exact words on any of that to get there. Those are all verifiable through things like multiple attestation, through embarrassment, through these other things. So it's a great question, but and that is often what people do. They get concerned because they think that there's a slippery slope from accepting this down to basically abandoning inerrancy and inspiration in the deity of Christ. And I just think it's not like that. That's a non sequitur that often gets well-meaning but wrong-headed, right-hearted, wrong-headed introduced into the conversation. Sorry, I took way too long on that question, but it's a great question. Anybody else?
So, Ryan, Muslim apologists, if you're interacting with them and they talk about this fig tree and consistency and all these things, you're trying to point them to John Ratul's and Greco-Roman biography and all those things. How do you condense this down into like an elevator pitch?
Oh, gosh. That is a great question. Oh, man. Yeah. Oh, boy. Question was, how do you condense all of this into an elevator pitch? You know what I would probably do is I'd use the chronological snobbery quip. I'd say, we live in an era of great chronological snobbery where we have a misunderstanding of what we're expecting ancient literature to do. And once you basically remove ourselves from the now, put ourselves in terms of the always, and start treating the Gospels on their own terms rather than on ours, they hold up perfectly. And if you're worried about things like what Seth brought up, there's a place to go for that, right? You can use these objective historical methods to come up with these things. And I'd remind them that, it is a fascinating question, but it's actually more helpful for pedagogy, right? For teaching within the church after you've already decided what to do with Jesus. But it doesn't change those two questions. Who did Jesus claim to be, and did Jesus rise from the dead? I don't know if that's the perfect elevator pitch, but you put me on the spot. That's probably where I would start, and then go from there. Incidentally, Lycona's book is really helpful on this. He got a bad rep on that when it came out, and I do not think it was deserved. And even if you end up disagreeing with him on certain pericopes, it's still very helpful for introducing you in very understandable terms to all these things that we talked about tonight, and he goes through dozens of examples. And there's one in particular that I think nobody in this room will probably agree with, and that's fine. It has to do with the dead raising. Actually, somebody asked this last week about the dead rising from their tombs after Jesus' resurrection. Somebody asked Dr. Williams about that one. What Lycona thinks about that, you probably won't, I'll just be honest. I haven't made up my mind on it yet, but that's fine, because you can still appreciate what he's doing methodologically and so many of his other examples. Even if you're not going to follow him on every case, that's fine. I would still recommend it as a good introduction to the subject. And that book is called Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? And for the record, I'll say again, I do think he gets a bad rep there that is not really deserved. We need to be a little bit kinder to Lycona. He did a lot of good work here. So,
All right.
Okay.
We're basically out of time here, so thanks a lot.
all right.
Ryan.
Thanks, Alan. Happy to hang around